chapter 25, we're going to be looking at three main topics, all dealing with homeostasis. One of the topics is fluid balance or fluid homeostasis. We've actually seen this really throughout the chapter, beginning with throughout the course, beginning with chapter 16 on the endocrine system, but we'll look at a few new things here as well. Electrolyte balance, and then acid and base balance. So let's begin by looking at fluid balance. What we're talking about is our body fluids. So to understand fluid balance, you really need to understand where is all of the body fluid located. And so on this slide, you kind of see, all these different fluids. You're probably familiar with all of these. We've already talked about blood plasma. That's part of your body fluid. Interstitial fluid, that's fluid that's, in the tissues, in the organs. Cytosol, that's the fluid that makes up the cytoplasm of the cell, so intracellular fluid inside of a cell. You're probably familiar with cerebrospinal fluid. This is the fluid that circulates in the brain and the spinal cord. Lymphatic fluid or lymph fluid, that's in your lymphatic vessels. And then any of the exocrine glands that are secreting fluids, sweat, oil glands and things, salivary glands, tear glands, all of these exocrine type glands are secreting fluids. All of this makes up the body's water-based type of liquids. And then electrolytes, when we'll talk about this, there's a couple of things to mention about the definition for this. Electrolytes, you can consider to be ions. An ion is a charged particle or charged atom that may have a positive charge. If that's the case, we call that a cation. If it has a negative charge, we call that an anion. The other way to think about electrolytes are things that don't dissociate into ions once you mix them with water. So a good example is if you take a look at the diagram here on the left side, you see sodium chloride or salt. And everybody knows if you put salt in water, it's going to dissolve. But in addition to dissolving, it actually dissociates. It actually divides or splits into sodium ions and negative ions. And so they kind of divide out. Well, that's different than something like C6H12O6, which is glucose. You take this, you put this in water. Now it's going to dissolve. It will dissolve, but that's different than dissociation. Glucose does not dissociate in water. In other words, it doesn't break down into individual ions. Instead, it stays together, but like I said, it does dissolve. So electrolyte would be something like a salt, sodium chloride, that does dissociate, and then a non-electrolyte is something like a sugar here, in this case glucose, that will not dissociate. Then the last main topic of the chapter is acids and bases, and we've seen a few things about acids and bases throughout, and so we'll kind of mention a few more things about this, but here's a good definition of an acid. It releases hydrogen ions into a solution. So for example, hydrochloric acid. This is considered to be an acid because when this is in a solution, it dissociates into hydrogen ions and chloride ions, and it releases hydrogen ions into the solution. And so really when you measure pH, you're trying to measure the concentration of the hydrogen ions in that solution. The more hydrogen ions you have, the more acidic it is, and the lower the pH scale. And the fewer hydrogen ions you have, the less acidic it is, and the higher the pH scale. And then a definition for a base or an alkaline chemical is something that kind of removes hydrogen ions from a solution. So the second example is sodium hydroxide. That's a strong base. And so it dissociates in a liquid to sodium ions, hydroxide ions. But the power of that hydroxide ion is that it soaks up, it's almost like a sponge. It soaks up hydrogen ions. So for example, if you try to imagine if you had hydrogen ions very close to the hydroxide ions, that hydrogen and the hydroxide would combine. They would absorb the hydroxide ion. Is like it binds to the hydrogen, it removes it from solution, and then you have water because you'll have the H plus the OH, which gives you H2O, which is water. So a base has the ability to remove those hydrogen ions from the solution. So those are the three main topics. So let's start back at fluid balance or fluid homeostasis. We kind of mentioned the different types of fluids that you have. Now we need to look at their location. Really, when you think about it, fluids are either going to be two places. They're inside of a cell or they're not inside the cell. They're outside the cell. And so if they're inside the cell, that's called intracellular fluid. That's inside the cells of the body. That represents about 60% of all of your body fluid. The diagram kind of does a nice job. They kind of show you, some cells over here. They have cytosol. That's the fluid portion of the cytoplasm on the inside of a cell. They estimate that in the body you would have about 60%, or roughly 26 liters of fluid that is inside of your cells, which is a lot of fluid inside of your cells. 60% of all the body fluid is located intracellular. And then extracellular, any fluid that's outside of the cells would be extracellular, and that's about 40%, roughly 16 liters. That includes your interstitial fluid, and it also includes the plasma. Now, for homeostasis, we have to, recognize that you're always losing water and you're always gaining water. That's the balance. That's the process of homeostasis. And so we need to kind of find out, how do you lose water? How do you gain water? Well, you can kind of imagine the way you gain water, the sources of water. By far, the water that we have in the body gets to us basically because we're eating and drinking. It's in the food that we eat, and it's in the drinks, the water that you drink. And so that's ingestion. So about 90% of the water that's inside of your body, intracellular, extracellular, 90% of all that water comes because you're eating it, you're drinking it. However, if you remember from the chapter on cell respiration, there is a small amount of water produced at the end of cell respiration in the electron transport system that accounts for about 10% of your overall water source in the body. Now, how are you going to lose water? Well, 60% is lost as urine. That's a pretty high number, but maybe not as high as you might think, because there's actually other ways to lose water. Evaporation accounts for roughly a third of all water loss, which is pretty significant. And we'll talk about those processes, perspiration and through respiration. And then a small amount of water, just a minimal amount, is lost in feces. And so, the large intestine tries to do a pretty good job of removing or reabsorbing a lot of that water from the waste, but you have to have a little bit there. And so about 4% is lost in feces. So let's look at how you're regulating the loss of water. All right. Homeostasis, you're trying to balance it. So you've got a few things in place to try to balance out water loss. The kidneys are the main organs that are trying to regulate water loss. And so in the process that we talked about of reabsorption, and that goes through, the three functions of the kidneys are the filtration, reabsorption, secretion. Reabsorption is a process where it's trying to reabsorb a lot of that filtrate. And so it's trying to regulate water loss that way. The respiratory system, there's not as much things really here that you can do, but you do lose a significant amount of water through the respiratory system, through breathing. And so, you have a lot of moisture coming out of your mouth and your airways and out of your nose whenever you're breathing, when you're exhaling. And so some factors may change that may influence how you are losing water. So the air temperature, if it's hotter, or if the humidity is low and it's very dry outside, maybe you'll lose water at a faster rate. If your body temperature is warmer, you may sweat more, and so you're losing water at a faster rate. And if you're breathing, your expiration volume, how deep are you breathing, that may determine a little bit of how much you are losing water through the respiratory way. Now, a couple of vocab words for you here: sensible versus insensible water loss. If you can pinpoint the location of that water loss, or if you can measure that water loss, so you could technically measure the urine, how much is being lost, how much water is coming out through the urine, how much water is coming out through the feces, then that's called sensible water loss. It's a measurable amount. Insensible means I really can't measure it. You can estimate it. We estimated how much is coming from evaporation or perspiration, but you can't really measure that very easily. So that's called an insensible water loss. Regulation of water gain, homeostasis of water gain here is really four main things. And so several of these we've already looked at in previous chapters, but we'll kind of review these here again. One way is regulation of thirst. And so you have thirst receptors, and this is part of what the hypothalamus is doing. It's regulating a lot of different things, but one of the things it does is to regulate thirst, because it has specialized nerve cells called osmoreceptors that are looking at or measuring how concentrated your body fluids are. And so if your body fluids are too concentrated, then it signals the hypothalamus to kind of make you thirsty. It tells your body that you need more fluids to counteract that high concentration of salts that you have in your body. And so it tries to help you become more hydrated. So if you're dehydrated, then your osmolarity, your concentration is going up. You're dehydrated, and so you're going to start feeling thirsty. And that's the process of what the hypothalamus is doing. Another way that you regulate water gain is through the RAS mechanism. We talked about this before, the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone mechanism. And so we'll kind of review this briefly here. If you have lower amounts of fluid, lower body fluids, then you need more body fluids, then that can be detected by the kidneys. The kidney secretes the chemical renin. That's a hormone that kind of works as an enzyme here, because it drives the pathway from angiotensinogen from the liver that converts that into angiotensin 1. Then if you remember, angiotensin converting enzyme is a chemical from the lungs. Actually, lung cells produce this, pneumocytes produce this, and that converts angiotensin 1 to angiotensin 2. The angiotensin 2 triggers the adrenal cortex to produce aldosterone. It also has other effects. So angiotensin 2 alone causes you to be thirsty. It increases your salt appetite. It increases how much ADH that you're secreting. That helps you to retain more fluid, and it increases how much, and eventually causes your aldosterone from the adrenal cortex to be released. So all these things work together to try to increase your body fluids, to try to help you gain water. And that in turn will cause your blood pressure to balance back out, hopefully, and go back up if it was low. So the RAS mechanism is one way, or another way, the second way to balance water gain. Another way that we've talked about quite a bit is ADH, antidiuretic hormone. It's the same information we looked at. I've just kind of put it in terms of osmolarity here. Osmolarity is the measurement of how concentrated your body fluids are. So if the body fluids are more concentrated, increased osmolarity means you need to have more body fluids to kind of balance all that out. So that's going to trigger your thirst sensation, and it's going to cause the pituitary gland to release more ADH. ADH is going to help you to retain fluids, which should hopefully balance out your osmolarity. And then, of course, the opposite is true. If your body fluids are not as concentrated, you can decrease, your osmolarity would be lower, your concentration is lower. And so now you need to inhibit your thirst. You have plenty of fluids, maybe you're overhydrated, and now you can decrease your ADH as well. So number 3 is ADH, and then number 4 is another hormone we've looked at several times, ANH or ANP as it's in your textbook, atrial natriuretic hormone or atrial natriuretic peptide. This is a hormone that is produced by the right atrium, and this is there. So let's say that your body fluids are elevated, maybe you are overhydrated, and your blood volume is high. That causes more fluid to return back to the right atrium. The blood pressure in the right atrium is higher. That causes a little stretch reflex, and that causes the heart to produce and release the ANH or the ANP hormone. That causes the kidneys to start getting rid of some of the sodium that it can. So it gets rid of some sodium ions, and then because of osmosis, water wants to follow that sodium, and that helps you to decrease your fluid balance there, your fluid levels. So that's fluid homeostasis. Now let's look at electrolyte homeostasis. We'll look at a few of these on the first part of the video. Section 3 talks about electrolyte homeostasis, and we'll look at 6 main electrolytes or ions that are balanced in the body. The first one is one of the main ones that we'll look at is sodium. And for each one, we'll kind of look at just a few things of why the ion is important and a couple of conditions that may affect if it's out of balance, if it's higher than normal or lower than normal. And so one thing to note here about sodium is that the kidneys are the main organs that are trying to regulate your sodium levels. So they're trying to balance sodium, and you do lose a little bit in sweat, perspiration. You'll lose a little bit of sodium, but it's a very small amount. So the kidneys are the main route at which you lose sodium. And it is regulated, again, based on fluid balance and based on two main hormones, aldosterone and the ANP, really. The ANP is trying to get rid of extra sodium, and the aldosterone is trying to retain sodium. So those are the two main ones that are directly causing an increase or decrease in sodium. And then you also have ADH, which we mentioned, of course, and that helps to balance the fluid level. If the sodium is in a state of imbalance, it may be either too high or too low. And so if it's too high, it's referred to as hypernatremia. Just a couple things about the word. Of course, hyper means greater than. And you see the emia portion of the word, and that refers to the blood. So we're talking about how much sodium, too much sodium really, in the blood. And by the way, the natremia, the NAT part here, comes because the Latin form of the word, or of sodium, the Latin word of sodium is natrium. That's where we get the symbol here, Na. That's why sodium is not SO on the periodic table, it's Na, because it comes from natrium, which is Latin form of sodium. So that's why it's called hypernatremia. That's just where it gets its terminology from. Some of the symptoms associated with this, all of the problems with sodium, because of the need for it in your sodium potassium pumps in the cells, creating the action potential membrane, the membrane potential, and the action potentials, it affects nervous system function, and it affects muscle function. So all these different symptoms really relate back to its function as an ion. Confusion, muscle twitching, spasms, seizures, and then very severe can cause comas. And the reason, some of the causes, it could be severe dehydration. Severe dehydration means your sodium levels are going up. It could be because you have too much of the aldosterone. Remember, aldosterone tries to retain sodium. So it could be because your aldosterone is just way too high. Hyponatremia, this is too little sodium in the body. Symptoms here still kind of go back to the same thing, because you're not balancing your what's balancing out your ions for your action potentials, your electrical potentials in the body. And so nausea, headache, confusion, fatigue, muscle weakness, especially muscle weakness and spasms here. Perhaps it's a couple of causes here. Overhydration could cause it. You have you're not getting enough sodium, or your sodium is being diluted too much. It could be a problem with ADH, because ADH, if it secretes too much, then that means you're retaining too much fluid, and that causes your sodium concentration to go down as well. Both of these could also point to the kidneys, because remember, the kidneys are trying to balance your sodium concentration. Now, second main ion we'll look at, electrolyte we'll look at, is potassium. These kind of go together because of the sodium potassium pumps that are inside of the cell body, inside the cells, the membrane potentials that have to be here. And so if you remember how the membrane potentials kind of work, your depolarization on the graph, that's where your sodium ions kind of flood into the cell. And then your repolarization event is where the potassium outflows, and that helps to reestablish your resting membrane potential. Whether you're talking about skeletal muscle, or you could be talking about nervous system, nerve cells, neuron cells, or you could talk about cardiac cells, because they all require this balance and this movement of sodium ions and potassium ions. And so so any change in the potassium is going to affect your resting membrane potentials. This is maintained, just like most of your other ions, in a very narrow range. In other words, it's closely monitored, because it doesn't take much change in potassium to have some bad side effects. And it's basically being monitored by or controlled by the aldosterone, just like the sodium is. And then you can have too much potassium. That's called hyperkalemia. And again, the word here is coming from the Latin form of potassium. The abbreviation is K. That's where you get the hyperkalemia here. Symptoms: malaise, just an overall feeling of weakness and sick type feeling. Palpitations, that's because of the heart. The heart muscle is not, you don't have the right amount of potassium leaving the cardiac cells, and so it's having a hard time reestablishing its resting membrane potential. Muscle weakness, and then potentially even muscle failure. Usually, if you have a problem with potassium, it points to some kind of kidney problem, because the kidneys are trying to balance out your potassium levels, just like they're balancing out the sodium levels, or it could point to a hormone problem such as aldosterone. And then you have hypokalemia, where you don't have enough potassium, and that leads the cells to become hyperpolarized. They're too far polarized, and some of the symptoms there, again, because it affects the action potentials, you're going to have muscle weakness, confusion, and it'll affect the heart rate and actually start slowing it down because of the hyperpolarization. It takes longer to depolarize a new and to create a new action potential if your cell's already hyperpolarized. Some of the causes of potassium ions, maybe there's too many diuretics. In other words, if you're taking a diuretic for blood pressure and you're taking too much for your system, it could cause that effect. Vomiting, diarrhea, hypersecretion of aldosterone, any of these could cause too little potassium.